The workplace can be very confusing nowadays. When we look at the careers our parents or grandparents have had, it contrasts that with our own options today. It can be very difficult to make sense of what we can expect from our employers and what they can expect of us in return as employees. You might say it's simple. They pay me and I do the work, but there's a lot more to it than that. If you go into the workforce without clear awareness about the expectations that you have, it can lead to a lot of unnecessary frustration and disappointment. So we're going to compare and contrast the old versus the new social contract to help you make sense of the world of work. So what do we mean by social contract? Well, this is the agreement that defines the relationship between the employers and the employees. And that word agreement is in quotations because it's the written and the unwritten understandings, expectations, norms, and common practices that exist between employers and employees. These are the collective norms, obligations, mutual benefits at play in the workplace. So it's not exactly a contract, although some aspects of this are contractual. Others are just norms that have developed over time. Under the old social contract, this is likely the agreement that your parents and certainly your grandparents grew up under. There was this expectation of lifetime employment in exchange for loyalty from the employee. Now, that doesn't mean that this was actually your entire life just working for one employer, but the idea was once you got a job, if you were okay at it, pretty good at it, you would continue to keep that job. And in exchange, you would only work there. You would only work for that employer full time. So this is a little different than it is nowadays, where lots of people have various jobs. But back in the day, under the old social contract, in traditional industries, you were only supposed to work for your full-time employer. In fact, they had a word for it, a dirty word that they called moonlighting. If you were caught moonlighting, that meant you had a part-time job at nights or on the weekends, and that was seen as disloyal to your full-time employee, and they would maybe even fire you over it if they found out you were working on the side. But the older generation grew up this way, and the new social contract, the way we're growing up now and going to the world of work now, is really change and turnover are the default. People are changing jobs constantly. In fact, I looked up some statistics, and nowadays, if you're in the age group of 25 years old to 34 years old, you're only staying at a job for about 2.8 years. That's really fast. Lots of turnover, lots of change. It's very different from lifetime employment. And even nowadays, even the older generation, let's say 55 to 64, they stay at their jobs almost 10 years. So granted, they are maybe settled into their occupations now that they've tried a few things, but you can see the difference that the older generation definitely tends to still have an old social contract mentality. But in contrast to staying at a long time, Generation Z is predicted to have 7 different careers, entirely different careers over their lifetime, and about 17 different jobs over their lifetime. An important point to make is that the old social contract organizations have not completely vanished or gone away. We still have teachers working for schools like universities or high schools. We still have firefighters. We still have police officers, many other occupations where you go to work, you stay there for a long time, and a lot of the arrangements we've been talking about fall under the old social contract. Those exist at the same time as many new organizations like startups and .com type companies, Uber Eats, and all kinds of new business models that are popping up all the time that are definitely under the new social contract arrangement. So both exist at the same time, which is one of the reasons why we have lots of confusion about how we fit in to our employer's world and how they fit into ours. Under the old social contract, people worked full-time on site, that means in person, 40 hours a week, and they were paid extra for overtime. Under the new social contract, the hours are varied. There's maybe some freelancing happening, some contract work, some quote gig work as they call it, solopreneurship, which is like you're a freelancer, but you have your own business. So you have maybe a laptop and some other gear at home and you do your work from home. Maybe you're working from home in actual positions that you work for another employer, but you're you're telecommuting, essentially working virtually. Those are all very new compared to the way we used to do things where you would be on site most of the time. And I know that things are changing and more companies are saying, oh no, you have to come back to work. But we do live in an age where these variables are contested. The hours, the extent to which you're really a full-time permanent employee compared to the way it used to be. Under the old social contract, promotions were based upon seniority. They called this the seniority ladder. In fact, I used to work at a university that used seniority to make most decisions. Most universities still do use the old social contract, in fact, but this is the way it worked in a very small sense. We all worked in a building, and anytime someone retired or left for another job, their office would become available. And the people who had been there the longest, the most senior professors, got first dibs on whether or not they wanted to move into that empty office. And if they didn't want it, it went to the next most senior person, and then to the next most senior person, until it worked all the way down to the newest person. And at one point, I was the newest person and an office became available. But there was a guy who was also almost as new as me, but since he was hired 2 weeks before me, he got dibs on that empty office. Now, 2 weeks in the lifespan of a professor is like the blink of an eye, but they used the seniority ladder to make decisions about all kinds of things. Under the new social contract, your advancement, for example, your promotions and things like that, are based upon your competence and your social capital. So it's what you know and how good you are at your job, and also the strength of your social ties and connections. So you get exposed to cool projects and maybe get advanced and get promoted and get put in charge of new things because of those relational connections. It doesn't mean you're not good at your job. It just means it's not a pyramid or a seniority ladder that you're climbing. You are advancing through your relationships with other people. Under the old social contract, there was a big emphasis on benefits, not just salary, but benefits that came with a job, like health insurance, vision, dental, paid vacations, and other types of benefits. Back in the 1980s, when the old social contract was still humming along, over 90% of employers offered full-time employees health benefits and usually paid for the whole thing. Nowadays, benefits are in question. There's been a decline. Many employers still have benefits, but only from about 50 to 75% of employers have health benefits. And oftentimes, new companies don't have any. And that 50 to 75% that still offer benefits, a lot of them are the old employers that have still been around. So many new employers don't have any health benefits, and they usually expect the employee to pay a good chunk of those health insurance premiums, for example. So benefits is another area that has changed a lot as we've moved to the new social contract. Under the old social contract, you worked for an employer for a long time, you qualified for a pension, and then once you retired, you got that pension for life. The pension is a continued paycheck, essentially. There's like a calculation where, let's say you work somewhere 25, 30 years, they give you a percentage of your final few years of employment. So like they give you 75% of your paycheck for life after you retire. If you've been there long enough, you've made a certain amount. And back in the 1980s, about half of all full-time workers could qualify for a pension. Over 80% of medium and large companies offered pensions. That's a massive amount of employers who are participating in this pension system. And since then, new organizations and even some older organizations, old social contract, have gotten rid of pensions and they've moved to a different approach. Nowadays, most new employees either have an individual retirement account, an IRA, they have a 401k, which is employer sponsored, or a version of that for education is 403b, but it's the same. 401k, 403b are employer sponsored programs, and an IRA is where you do it on your own. So I started an IRA, a retirement account, individual retirement account, when I was still delivering pizza a long time ago, back in the 1990s. And through graduate school, I was contributing to my individual retirement account, and I still have one of those. Nowadays, only about 15% of full-time workers still have that old school pension, and many employers offer this 401k, 403b option. Now, what's the difference? Well, under a pension system, the employer continues to pay you. Essentially, they own your pension. And if they go out of business, if something happens bad, you might lose your pension. That has happened when certain companies have gone bankrupt. Under the new social contract of 401k, you put in a certain amount of money of your paycheck. they may match that. In some cases, they'll match it. So if you put in $10, they put in $10. If you put in $100, they put in $100. But then after a certain number of months, you own that. So when you leave your employer, your money comes with you. So you don't have to stay there for a lifetime to get your retirement money. It sits there and grows in an account until you retire. And then once you retire, you can draw on that. And many people, like myself, have multiple 401k programs or 401(k) accounts because we've moved a couple of times to different employers. And you can see that in one case, you've got to stick with one employer for a long, long time. In other cases, you can move around a little bit. So a question for you, did your parents or your grandparents work for an old social contract type of employer or a new social contract type of employer? And which social contract fits you better with how you see your relationship between your employer and your employee? And another question for you is, how do you believe the social contract, that is the relationship between employers and employees, will change in the coming years? Things are changing constantly, and we really don't know how that relationship will develop over the coming 5, 10 years or more. So I'm curious if you have an opinion on that as well. I look forward to hearing your comments and feedback in the comment section below. Take care.